My husband begged me to sleep with his friend while he watched from the shadows. He swore it was a fantasy that would save our boring marriage. So I did it. I let a stranger touch me while my husband stared. But the next morning I didn't get a thank you. I got served divorce papers. It wasn't a kink. It was a trap. Our Sunday mornings always began the same way, unfolding with a precision that felt like a schedule approved by a committee years ago. The rich aroma of fresh coffee would drift through the kitchen, mingling with the dry ink and paper scent of the newspaper my husband, Michael, stubbornly continued to subscribe to despite living in the age of digital technology. It was a ritual of tactile comfort, the rustling pages serving as the background score to our lives, accompanied by the distant rhythmic drone of a neighbor's lawnmower buzzing across the street. We lived in that specific type of small American town where the only breaking news for the entire week might be the grand opening of a new bakery on Main Street, or the mayor's golden retriever escaping its yard again. Our marriage was exactly like this town. Cozy, predictable, and undeniably safe, much like this house with its perfectly painted white fence. I loved this tranquility, or at least I had spent the last decade convincing myself that this lack of turbulence was the same thing as happiness. That morning I stood by the kitchen sink, rinsing the foam from a ceramic plate, and found myself watching Michael. He sat at the wooden table, a beam of morning sunlight illuminating the thinning hair on the crown of his head, and he seemed to me the absolute foundation of my life. He was reliable, steady, and completely devoid of any mystery or danger. It was a comforting thought, yet as I scrubbed the dishes, a small unbidden part of me wondered if reliability was enough to sustain a soul for a lifetime. The day passed in a blur of domestic routine, but when evening finally arrived and we had tucked the children into their beds, the atmosphere in the house shifted perceptibly. We opened a bottle of wine, the cork popping with a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet kitchen. Michael was unusually silent, his demeanor lacking its usual easygoing nature. His fingers, typically so sure and steady, were nervously twisting the delicate stem of his wine glass, creating a rhythmic clinking against the table. I finally asked him what was wrong, my mind immediately jumping to the standard anxieties of our class and station. I expected to hear about a sudden problem at his office, or perhaps an unexpected bill that would require us to tighten our belts for a month. I was prepared to be the supportive wife, to offer solutions and comfort for the mundane troubles of suburban life. Instead of answering immediately, he stopped fidgeting and looked up, locking his eyes onto mine with an intensity that made me freeze. He looked me straight in the eyes with a gaze I had never seen in all our years together. A complex, frightening mixture of deep shame and a dark, feverish hunger. It was the look of a man standing on a precipice, deciding whether to step back or jump. He took a breath that shuddered in his chest, and told me that he wanted to see me with someone else. He did not want to just know about it. He wanted to be there, in the room, watching it happen as a spectator to his own wife's intimacy. The request itself was shocking enough to stop my heart, but he did not stop there. He did not want me with a stranger or a nameless face from a bar. He said he wanted to see me with his friend, Marcus. It was the same Marcus who came to our backyard barbecues, the man who stood by the grill laughing at Michael's jokes, the one who always maintained a polite, respectful distance from me. The mention of his name turned the abstract fantasy into a tangible, terrifying reality. My hand trembled violently, a physical rejection of the words hanging in the air between us. The wine glass I was holding jerked, and the red liquid sloshed over the rim. It splashed onto the pristine, snow-white tablecloth, spreading outward in seconds. I stared down at it, unable to look at my husband, watching the crimson stain expand like an ugly, gaping wound that I knew, with absolute certainty, would never be completely washed away. The days that followed that Sunday morning confession did not pass in a sequence of hours or minutes, but rather drifted by in a thick, suffocating fog that seemed to alter the very physics of my world. I moved through the familiar geography of our town like a ghost haunting her own life, detached and observing from a great, insurmountable distance. The bright yellow school buses rumbling down the street, which used to be comforting symbols of our wholesome community, now looked like garish, distorted toys in a diorama that I had suddenly outgrown. I looked at the shop windows on Main Street, with their displays of seasonal decorations and sensible clothing, and they seemed to be mocking me with their aggressive normalcy. Every interaction with the neighbor became a surreal performance of deception, a test of my ability to maintain the facade of the woman they thought they knew. Mrs. Gable, who lived 2 doors down, waved at me from her porch, and her smile seemed to stretch too wide, her face becoming a grotesque mask of suburban contentment. I waved back, the muscle memory of politeness taking over my arm, but in my head, the world was tilting on its axis. The reality I had inhabited for over a decade had revealed itself to be paper-thin, a fragile stage set that my husband had slashed open with a few whispered sentences. Michael's words were not just a shocking request. They were a persistent infection that had taken root in the deepest folds of my brain. They looped in my mind with the relentless persistence of an obsessive melody, replaying the moment his voice cracked with that mixture of shame and desire. I knew the script that society, my upbringing and common decency had written for a woman in my position. I was supposed to be horrified to my core, to feel a righteous indignation that would burn the house down. I was supposed to pack a bag, take the children, and drag him to a priest or a therapist to exorcise this filth from our lives. But the reaction that bloomed within me was not disgust, or at least not only disgust. Instead, beneath the initial shock and the layer of fear, something dark, ancient, and insatiably curious began to stir in the pit of my stomach. It was a sensation I had not felt since my reckless youth, a thrill that came from standing too close to the edge of a cliff. The idea that my husband, this pillar of stability, this man who mowed the lawn on Saturdays and balanced the checkbook, was harboring such a deviant hunger was terrifying, yet it was also the most interesting thing that had happened to us in years. Marcus became the focal point of this new, distorted reality, transforming in my mind from a casual family friend into a symbol of everything forbidden. He was the absolute physical and energetic antithesis of Michael. Where Michael was soft edges, pale skin, and the comfort of a well-worn armchair, Marcus was constructed of hard angles and undeniable vibrant presence. He was tall, towering over most men in our circle, with skin the color of deep, polished ebony that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. I found myself replaying every interaction I had ever had with him, searching my memory for clues I might have missed. I remembered the sound of his voice, a baritone that seemed to vibrate in his chest and resonate in the air long after he stopped speaking. I thought about the way he moved at our backyard gatherings, with a languid, predatory grace that made Michael's nervous, busy energy seem frantic by comparison. Marcus had always been polite, maintaining a respectful distance that I now realized was a wall he had built, perhaps out of respect for Michael, or perhaps out of a lack of interest. The thought that Michael, this bastion of traditional American values who worried about credit scores and crabgrass, lay awake at night visualizing this specific man touching me was a revelation that shook me to my core. It was shocking, yes, but it was also frighteningly arousing. It turned the power dynamic of our marriage upside down. Michael was effectively offering me up, but in doing so, he was elevating me to an object of supreme desire, a prize to be shared and watched. The degradation he was proposing felt, in a twisted, confusing way, like a strange form of worship. We began to discuss it, tentatively at first, and then with an increasing, feverish frequency that consumed our nights. These conversations never happened in the light of day, where the sun might expose the absurdity of it all. They happened in the safety of the dark bedroom, with the heavy curtains drawn tight against the street lamps and the prying eyes of the neighbors. We spoke in whispers like conspirators plotting a crime, our voices low and thick with tension. The air between us in that bed, usually stale with the routine of sleep, became charged with an electric, heavy anticipation. Michael, in his attempt to maintain some semblance of control over the chaos he had unleashed, began to establish rules and boundaries. He spoke with the precision of a lawyer drafting a contract, detailing exactly where he would sit, what lighting we would use, and what acts were permissible. He wanted to be the director of this scene, the puppet master pulling the strings of his wife and his friend. He outlined scenarios where he would remain a passive observer, a shadow in the corner, ensuring that the intimacy remained a performance for his benefit. However, as he listed his conditions, no kissing on the mouth, no emotional intimacy, a strict time limit, I felt a shift occurring within me. He thought he was setting the stage to protect his ego, but I realized that by setting these rules, he was essentially handing me the reins of power. He wanted to be the spectator. He wanted to see me lose control, to see his wife unraveled by another man. But in his desire to watch, he was making me the protagonist. I was the one who would be touched, I was the one who would feel, and he would be left in the dark watching from the outside. I agreed to his plan, but not for the reasons he likely told himself. I did not agree to save our marriage, or to satisfy his kink, or to be a dutiful wife. I agreed because for the first time in a decade, I felt a strange cold wind of freedom blowing through the cracks of my life. This dirty secret, this violation of our vows, promised an escape from the stifling perfection of my existence. It was a key to a door I had not realized was locked, and the curiosity of what lay behind it was stronger than my fear of the consequences. The decision was made on a Tuesday night, after a particularly intense session of whispering in the dark. We decided that Friday would be the night. It gave us enough time to prepare, but not enough time to back out. Friday night dinner. It was a common enough occurrence in our social circle, a harmless invitation that would raise no eyebrows. But we both knew that this dinner would be the last supper of our conventional life. Once we crossed this line, there would be no returning to the innocence of Sunday morning coffees and newspapers. The task of making the call fell to me, a test of my resolve and my ability to perform. I stood in the kitchen on Wednesday afternoon, the phone receiver feeling heavy and foreign in my hand, like a black plastic weapon. The house was silent, the children at school, Michael at work. It was just me and the hum of the refrigerator, standing on the precipice of moral ruin. I stared at the keypad, my heart hammering against my ribs, not with fear, but with a powerful adrenaline-fueled rhythm. I dialed the number for Marcus, reciting the digits from the contact list Michael had left next to the phone. The ringing sound on the other end seemed to stretch on for an eternity, each trill amplifying the tension in the room. I rehearsed my lines in my head, ensuring my voice would be light, casual, the perfect tone of a suburban housewife extending a friendly invitation. I needed to be convincing enough to get him here, but vague enough to not give the game away before the trap was sprung. When he finally answered, his voice was deep and warm, a stark contrast to the cold calculation running through my veins. He sounded surprised to hear from me, polite and unsuspecting. I gripped the counter with my free hand, grounding myself against the granite. I asked him if he was free this Friday, if he would like to come over for dinner, just the three of us. I told him Michael had mentioned they hadn't caught up in a while, and we had a nice bottle of wine we wanted to open. My voice did not tremble, not even once. I was astonished by my own capacity for duplicity. I sounded gracious, welcoming, and completely normal. I realized then that I was not just agreeing to a sexual encounter. I was stepping into a role. I felt like an actress walking onto the stage of the most important performance of her life, the spotlight blinding and hot. I was shedding the skin of the bored, reliable mother and becoming something else, something dangerous, desirable, and terrifyingly powerful. Marcus accepted the invitation with the easy grace that characterized him. He thanked me, asked if he should bring anything, and made a joke about Michael's grilling skills. I laughed at the right moment, a sound that felt bubbly and light, while inside I was screaming. I told him 7 o'clock would be perfect. When I hung up the phone, the silence rushed back into the kitchen, but it felt different now. It wasn't empty. It was pregnant with the inevitability of what was to come. The remaining days until Friday passed with an agonizing slowness. I looked at Michael differently now. When he came home from work, I searched his face for signs of the man who had whispered those dark things in the bedroom. I saw the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes followed me around the room, hungry and frightened. We were two people sharing a house, sharing a life, but we were now bound by a pact that separated us from the rest of the world. We were carrying a bomb, and we were counting down the seconds until it detonated. I spent hours in front of the mirror, analyzing my reflection. I looked for the woman Michael wanted Marcus to see. I examined the lines around my eyes, the curve of my hips, trying to see myself through the eyes of a stranger. I was 30 years old, a mother, a wife, but who was I really? This experiment was not just about sex, it was a psychological excavation. I was about to find out what I was made of, and whether the foundation Michael admired so much was made of stone or sand. Friday morning arrived with a gray, overcast sky that matched the turbulence inside our home. I moved through the motions of the day with a robotic efficiency. I cleaned the house until it sparkled, scrubbing away the evidence of our mundane existence. I wanted the stage to be perfect. I went to the market and bought the ingredients for a meal I knew Marcus liked: steaks thick and expensive, and a rich dark chocolate dessert. It felt like I was preparing an offering for a deity I did not fully understand. As the afternoon waned and the light began to fade from the sky, a strange calm settled over me. The nervousness evaporated, replaced by a steely resolve. I chose my outfit carefully, a dress that was modest enough for a dinner party but clung in the right places, hinting at the body beneath. I applied my makeup with precision, highlighting my eyes, painting my lips a shade of red that felt like a warning signal. When I walked downstairs, the floorboards creaking under my feet, I knew there was no turning back. The curtain was rising. Friday evening descended upon our quiet neighborhood, not with the gentle release of the workweek, but with a suffocating heavy density that seemed to press against the windows of our home. The air inside the house was stifling, thick with an unseasonable humidity that defied the climate control system, carrying an electric charge that made the fine hairs on my arms stand on end. Every object in the living room, the perfectly plumped cushions, the polished coasters, the meticulously arranged magazines, seemed to vibrate with a latent energy, as if the inanimate matter itself was aware of the transgression about to take place. I moved through the rooms with a conscious, deliberate slowness, feeling the weight of my own existence as if gravity had suddenly doubled its pull on my body. Michael was a portrait of unraveling nerves, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by a frantic, brittle tension that was painful to witness. He paced the length of the hardwood floor in the foyer, his footsteps echoing with a hollow, rhythmic thud that grated against my frayed nerves. He checked his wristwatch incessantly, a nervous tick that betrayed the depth of his anxiety, adjusting his collar and smoothing his hair as if preparing for a job interview rather than a dinner with an old friend. I watched him from the arched doorway of the dining room, feeling a strange, detached mixture of pity and dark curiosity, wondering if he truly understood the forces he was summoning into our carefully curated lives. At exactly 7 o'clock, the doorbell rang, the sound sharp and intrusive, cutting through the thick silence of the house like a physical blow. We both froze for a fraction of a second, caught like deer in headlights, before the reality of the moment kicked our limbs back into motion. Michael rushed to the door with a speed that bordered on desperation, while I remained a few steps behind, smoothing the fabric of my dress and commanding my heart to maintain a steady rhythm. As the heavy oak door swung open, the evening light flooded into the hallway, silhouetting the tall, broad figure standing on our porch, bringing the theoretical fantasy crashing into the tangible present. Marcus stepped across the threshold, his presence immediately filling the entryway and displacing the nervous energy Michael had been generating. He held a bottle of expensive red wine in one hand, his grip relaxed and confident, a stark contrast to Michael's twitching fingers. When he extended the bottle toward me, offering a polite greeting that rumbled deep in his chest, I reached out to take it. Our fingers brushed against each other in the exchange, a fleeting contact of skin against skin that should have been innocuous, a simple social transaction between a hostess and a guest. Instead, that brief touch sent a shockwave through my system that was as violent and immediate as grabbing a live wire. The sensation traveled from my fingertips up my arm, bypassing my brain entirely and settling deep in the pit of my stomach, a hot, heavy coil of recognition. It was not just the physical warmth of his hand. It was the sudden, terrifying realization of his reality. He was no longer just a concept or a prop in Michael's late-night whispers. He was a living, breathing man, and the electricity of that contact shattered the last protective layer of my detachment. Michael played the role of the genial host with a manic intensity, his voice a little too loud, his laughter a little too frequent and brittle. He ushered us into the living room, pouring drinks with hands that shook visibly, the glass decanter clinking against the crystal tumblers in a treacherous rhythm. I sat on the edge of the sofa, sipping my wine, watching the interplay between the two men with a hyper-awareness that made every detail stand out in high relief. Marcus was calm, his movements languid and deliberate, his dark eyes taking in the room with an observant intelligence that missed nothing. We moved to the dining table, the transition feeling rehearsed and stiff, like actors hitting their marks in a play we hadn't fully memorized. The conversation that flowed over the meal was a surreal exercise in absurdity, A mask of banality stretched thin over a roiling sea of tension. We talked about the unseasonable heat, the local baseball team's losing streak, and the new bakery on Main Street, our words acting as meaningless filler to bridge the silence. Yet, underneath the table, in the charged space between our bodies, a completely different silent dialogue was taking place, heavy with unspoken intent. I could feel Marcus watching me, not with the polite, passing glance of a family friend, but with a focused, predatory intensity that made my skin prickle. He looked at me not as Michael's wife or a mother of two, or a member of the PTA, but as a woman who had been offered up, a woman who had silently consented to be desired. His gaze felt physical, tracing the line of my throat and the curve of my shoulders, stripping away the suburban camouflage I had worn for so long. It was a look of raw, unadulterated hunger, but tempered with a patience that was far more dangerous than overt aggression. Michael, seated at the head of the table, was drinking his wine too quickly, his eyes darting back and forth between Marcus and me. He was fueling himself, drowning his hesitation in the expensive vintage, his face flushing with a mixture of alcohol and arousal. He was watching Marcus watch me, feeding off the energy, his own desire magnified by the presence of the other man. I realized then that for Michael, the eroticism lay not just in the act itself, but in the surrender of ownership, the thrill of seeing his most prized possession coveted by another. As the meal concluded and the plates were cleared away, the atmosphere in the room shifted from tense anticipation to a focused, inevitable trajectory. Michael poured the last of the wine into our glasses, his movements becoming more deliberate, heavier. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping harshly against the floorboards, and walked over to the high-end stereo system in the corner of the room. He pressed a button, and the room was suddenly filled with the slow, smoky sound of a jazz saxophone, the notes hanging in the humid air like smoke rings. This was the signal, the cue we had agreed upon in the darkness of our bedroom, the point of no return. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone, but my face remained impassive, frozen in a mask of calm waiting. Marcus stood up slowly, unfolding his tall frame with a grace that made the room feel smaller. He did not look at Michael. He looked only at me, his eyes locking onto mine with a magnetic pull that made it impossible to look away. He extended his hand toward me, palm open, an invitation that was both a question and a command. I looked at my husband, seeking one final confirmation, one last chance for him to stop the machinery he had set in motion. Michael had retreated to the large leather armchair in the shadowed corner of the room, positioning himself outside the circle of light cast by the chandelier. His face was partially obscured, but I could see the rigid set of his jaw and the gleam of his eyes in the darkness. He did not speak, did not move to intervene. He simply nodded, a barely perceptible dip of his chin that sealed our fate. I turned back to Marcus and placed my hand in his. His palm was hot and rough, the texture of his skin a shocking contrast to the smooth, soft hands of my husband. As he pulled me up from my chair, the strength in his arm was undeniable, effortless, and terrifying. He drew me into the center of the room, away from the safety of the table, into the open space where the music seemed to swirl around us. When he pulled me closer, the space between our bodies vanished, and I was suddenly enveloped in his presence. The smell of him filled my senses, a complex, intoxicating blend of expensive cologne, the faint, bitter scent of tobacco, and the underlying musk of male desire. It was a scent that triggered a primal response in my brain, bypassing logic and reason, awakening a dormant part of my physiology. We began to move to the slow rhythm of the jazz, barely swaying, our bodies pressed together in a way that was indecent for a dinner party but essential for what we were becoming. I felt the heat radiating from his chest, seeping through the thin fabric of my dress, branding my skin with the evidence of his proximity. My head rested near his shoulder, and I could feel the steady, powerful thud of his heart, a rhythm that seemed slower and stronger than my own. We danced in a tiny, intimate circle, isolated from the rest of the world, spinning slowly in the center of my living room while the ghost of my marriage watched from the shadows. With every moment that passed, the wall I had spent 10 years building around myself, the wall of propriety, of fidelity, of safety, began to crumble. It did not fall with a crash, but rather dissolved, turning to dust under the heat of Marcus's touch and the weight of Michael's gaze. I closed my eyes, letting the sensation wash over me, feeling the terrifying, exhilarating rush of losing control. I was no longer the woman who organized bake sales and worried about crabgrass. I was a creature of sensation, drifting on a dark tide, moving further and further away from the shore of my known life. The music seemed to slow down, the notes stretching out, warping time until the only reality was the heat of his hand on the small of my back and the sound of our breathing. I was aware of Michael in the corner, his presence a heavy, silent pressure that pushed me closer to Marcus. I knew he was watching every subtle movement, every shift of my body, and the knowledge fed a dark, shameful fire in my belly. I was performing for him, yes, but I was also discovering a capacity for pleasure that had nothing to do with him. Marcus's hand moved slightly, his fingers spreading across my spine, possessive and firm. It was a claim, a silent assertion that in this moment, in this circle of light, I belonged to the rhythm of the music and the man holding me. I did not pull away. I leaned into it, my body betraying my vows with a fluidity that shocked me. The fear that had gripped me earlier had transmuted into something else entirely. A high-wire act of adrenaline and lust, a freefall into the unknown. As the song neared its end, the tension in the room reached a breaking point. The air was so thick it felt like water, drowning out the sounds of the suburban night outside. We were no longer in a small American town. We were in a void of our own making, a private universe governed by new dangerous laws. I opened my eyes and looked up at Marcus, and in the depth of his gaze, I saw the reflection of my own ruin, and it was beautiful. The woman I had been that morning was gone, replaced by someone I was only just beginning to meet. The transition from the living room to the bedroom felt less like walking through a familiar hallway and more like crossing a bridge into a foreign, hostile territory. The stairs creaked under our weight, familiar sounds that had once signaled the end of a long day of domestic routine, but now sounded like the groans of a structure struggling to support the weight of our collective deceit. I walked ahead, conscious of Marcus's heavy tread behind me, and the ghost-like silence of Michael following in our wake. The air in the upper hallway was stagnant, holding the trapped heat of the day, and as I pushed open the door to the master bedroom, I felt a distinct drop in temperature, as if the room itself was holding its breath in anticipation of the violation about to occur. The bedroom was submerged in a thick amber semi-darkness, illuminated only by the solitary street lamp standing sentinel on the corner of our block. The light filtered through the slats of the blinds, painting the room in horizontal stripes of shadow and gold, turning the familiar sanctuary of our marriage into a cage of light and dark. It distorted the shapes of the furniture, the dresser, the vanity, the heavy oak wardrobe, making them loom like silent judges in the periphery of my vision. I moved toward the bed, the mattress vast and pristine, its white duvet glowing faintly in the gloom like a sacrificial altar prepared for a ritual I was still trying to comprehend. Michael did not follow us to the bed. Instead, he moved with a practiced, silent efficiency to the corner of the room, where a high-backed wooden chair had been placed earlier in the day. I hadn't watched him put it there, but seeing it now, positioned perfectly in the shadows to offer an unobstructed view of the bed, sent a shiver of cold recognition down my spine. He sat down, merging with the darkness, his hands gripping the armrests with white-knuckled intensity. He was the director of this scene, the architect of this moment, but as I stood by the bed and turned to face him, I realized with a jolt of clarity that the leading role belonged entirely to me. Marcus moved into the space between me and the rest of the room, his large frame blocking out the bars of light, casting me into his personal shadow. When he reached out to touch me, his hand landing heavy and hot on my shoulder, the sensation was shockingly different from anything I had ever experienced with my husband. Michael's touch was familiar, often apologetic, always seeking reassurance. Marcus's touch was an assertion of presence, a demanding, almost rough claim that allowed for no hesitation. It was authoritative and devoid of the emotional baggage that weighed down every interaction I had with Michael, and that absence of history felt like a sudden, sharp intake of oxygen. He did not ask for permission. The script had already been written, the contracts signed in whispers and glances downstairs. He turned me around, his hands moving with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, and the sound of the zipper on my dress tearing down the back seemed deafening in the quiet room. The cool air hit my skin, followed immediately by the heat of his hands, and I felt a strange dissociative split occur within my mind. Part of me was the woman standing there, feeling the rough texture of his palms, but another part of me was floating near the ceiling, looking down at the tableau with cold, analytical fascination. I closed my eyes as the dress fell to the floor, a pool of fabric around my ankles, symbolizing the final shedding of my social identity. I gave myself over to the physical sensations, the roughness of his skin, the scent of cedar and musk, the overwhelming reality of a stranger's body against mine. But the darkness behind my eyelids felt like a retreat, a cowardice I could not afford. I had agreed to this not just to feel but to be seen. I opened my eyes, fighting the instinct to hide, and looked past the man holding me, searching the shadows of the corner for the eyes of my husband. I found him instantly. Michael was leaning forward in the chair, his body tense as a coiled spring, his face partially illuminated by a slice of street lamp glow. He was watching. He was not looking away in shame. He was not covering his eyes. He was staring with a fixated, unblinking intensity that was terrifying in its rawness. I could hear the sound of his breathing from across the room. Heavy, ragged, and uneven. A rhythm of distress and arousal that synced perfectly with the pounding of my own heart. In that moment, the triangular dynamic of the evening shifted into sharp, crystalline focus. I realized then that this was not simply about sex, nor was it about the physical man currently guiding me onto the bed. This was a complex psychological game, a theater of the mind where bodies were merely props. I was the instrument Michael was using to excavate his own deepest insecurities, his shame and his darkest, most repressed desires. He needed to see me taken by another to validate some twisted narrative in his head, to feel a pain that made him feel alive, or perhaps to confirm his own feelings of inadequacy. He was drinking in the sight of his wife with another man like a man dying of thirst drinks sand, desperate and self-destructive. But as I lay back against the pillows, feeling the weight of Marcus settle over me, I felt a surge of power that was intoxicating and entirely unexpected. Michael thought he was in control because he had set the stage, but from my vantage point on the bed I controlled everything. I controlled what he saw. I controlled how much he suffered. I controlled the pitch of his excitement. I was the one experiencing the act, the conduit through which all the energy in the room flowed. He was merely the spectator, impotent in his chair, dependent entirely on my performance for his gratification. This realization transformed the act from a passive submission into an active, aggressive performance. I began to play to the audience of one. When Marcus moved, I reacted not just with my body, but with my voice, arching my back further than necessary, letting a moan escape my lips that was louder, throatier, and more desperate than the physical sensation warranted. I wanted Michael to hear it. I wanted the sound to crawl under his skin and fester there. I wanted to brand this moment into his memory so deeply that he would never be able to look at me again without hearing the echo of my pleasure with another man. Marcus was magnificent in his role, a force of nature that required no instruction, but in my mind, he was reduced to a catalyst. He was the hammer striking the flint, but the spark, the fire, and the eventual conflagration were entirely between me and the silhouette in the corner. I looked at Michael over Marcus's shoulder, locking eyes with him, challenging him to look away, daring him to stop it. He didn't. He couldn't. He was paralyzed by the spectacle, trapped in the prison of his own fantasy, watching the woman he had vowed to cherish being possessed by the man he grilled burgers with on the 4th of July. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in until the only things that existed were the bed and the chair, the actor and the observer. The air grew heavy with the scent of sweat and sex, a primal atmosphere that obliterated the smell of lemon polish and lavender laundry detergent that usually defined our home. I felt a cruel, sharp pleasure in the destruction of that sanctity. Every movement, every sound was a hammer blow against the foundation of our conventional life, cracking the drywall, shattering the windows, bringing the roof down on top of us. I saw Michael's hand move to his face, covering his mouth as if to stifle a cry or a gasp, but his eyes never wavered. He was witnessing the death of his wife, not the physical woman, but the idea of her he had carried in his pocket for 10 years. The sweet, reliable, boring Grace was being immolated on this bed, burned away by the friction of another man's skin, And from the ashes something else was rising. I felt myself changing, hardening, the soft edges of my personality calcifying into something sharp and dangerous. As the intensity of the act built toward its inevitable conclusion, I lost track of where Marcus ended and I began, but I never lost track of Michael. I focused on him with a laser-like intensity, feeding off his voyeurism, using his gaze as a mirror to see this new version of myself. I was no longer the woman who worried about what the neighbors thought. I was a creature of appetite and power, capable of inflicting pain and pleasure in equal measure. I felt a scream building in my throat, a release that was about more than just physical climax. It was a scream of liberation and rage. When the moment finally broke, shattering the tension in the room with a physical force, I cried out Michael's name. It wasn't a plea for help, and it wasn't an act of love. It was an accusation. It was a way of pinning him to the moment, ensuring that he knew exactly who was responsible for this, and exactly who was enjoying it. I saw him flinch in the chair, his body jerking as if he had been struck, and I felt a dark, venomous satisfaction curl in my gut. The silence that rushed back into the room in the aftermath was deafening, heavier than the darkness itself. Marcus collapsed beside me, his breathing slowing, his role in the play concluded. I lay still, staring up at the ceiling, feeling the sweat cooling on my skin, listening to the ragged sound of my husband weeping silently in the corner. I did not cover myself. I did not reach for the sheet. I lay there in the wreckage of our marriage, feeling strangely, terrifyingly whole. In that dark room, illuminated by the prison bar stripes of the street lamp, I knew with absolute certainty that I had crossed a border. The country of my past life was behind me, visible but unreachable, separated by a chasm of experience that could never be bridged. I was no longer the woman who had washed dishes that morning. I was someone else entirely, someone who had looked into the abyss of her husband's desires and jumped in, only to find that she could swim. The play was over, but the consequences were just beginning to take shape in the shadows. The morning did not break with a burst of cleansing sunlight or a sense of renewal. Instead, it arrived as a gray, suffocating blanket that muffled the world outside and amplified the ringing silence inside my ears. I woke up into a stillness so profound it felt like pressure against my eardrums, a physical weight that pinned me to the mattress. The space beside me was empty, the pillow cool to the touch, indicating that Michael had left the bed hours ago, unable or unwilling to face the dawn beside me. The sheets were tangled around my legs, a chaotic topography of white cotton that bore the wrinkles and creases of the previous night's activity, a silent testament to the storm that had passed through this room. Marcus was gone. He had vanished sometime in the dark hours of the early morning, slipping away like a thief or a ghost, leaving behind nothing but the faint, lingering scent of his cologne and the smell of a stranger on my skin. I brought my hand to my face, inhaling deeply, and the smell was a shock to the system, musky, unfamiliar and undeniably real. It was the only proof that the night had not been a fever dream concocted by a starving mind. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, feeling a strange hollow ache in my chest that had nothing to do with physical pain and everything to do with the sudden, absolute solitude of my position. I finally summoned the strength to rise, my limbs feeling heavy and disconnected, as if my body were no longer entirely my own. I walked to the bathroom and stood before the mirror, examining my reflection with a clinical, detached curiosity. I expected to see a mark, a scarlet letter burned onto my forehead, some visible sign of the boundary I had crossed. But the woman staring back looked largely the same, tired perhaps, with dark circles under her eyes and hair that was wild and knotted, but fundamentally unchanged. It was a terrifying realization that the most profound alterations to the human soul leave no scars on the skin. I showered, scrubbing my skin until it turned pink and raw, trying to wash away not the touch of Marcus, but the feeling of the atmosphere that had permeated the bedroom. I used the hottest water I could stand, letting the steam fill the small room until I could barely breathe, hoping to purge the toxins of the night from my pores. When I dressed, I chose clothes that were shapeless and modest, layering a thick cardigan over a high-neck t-shirt, unconsciously trying to rebuild the armor I had so willingly shed just hours before. I needed to cover myself, to hide the body that had been the focal point of such intense, dark scrutiny. Descending the stairs felt like walking into a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided but not yet read. The house was quiet, disturbingly so for a Saturday morning. There was no sound of the television, no clattering of dishes, no hum of the radio. I walked toward the kitchen, my bare feet making no sound on the hardwood, moving with the hesitation of an intruder in my own home. I paused in the doorway, my hand gripping the frame, bracing myself for whatever waited for me in the heart of our domestic life. I didn't know what I expected. Gratitude, perhaps? A new fierce passion born of shared transgression? A closeness forged in the fire of our secret? Michael was sitting at the small breakfast table, his posture slumped and defeated, looking at a ceramic mug of black coffee as if it contained the answers to the universe's darkest riddles. He was wearing his bathrobe, the belt tied tightly around his waist, and he hadn't shaved. The stubble on his chin looked gray in the harsh morning light. He didn't look up when I entered the room. He didn't move a muscle. He was a statue of misery, carved from the dense, heavy atmosphere of the kitchen. The sunlight streaming through the window seemed to bend around him, avoiding him, leaving him in a personal pocket of shadow. I walked over to him, the silence stretching between us like a tightrope. I wanted to say something to bridge the gap, to acknowledge the massive earth-shattering thing we had done together. I reached out and placed my hand on his shoulder, a gesture of comfort, of solidarity, of wife to husband. Under my palm his muscles were rock hard, tense with the stress that vibrated through his shirt. I squeezed gently, trying to convey that I was there, that we were in this together, that we had survived the night. He flinched. It wasn't a subtle movement. It was a violent, involuntary jerk, as if he had been burned by a hot iron. He pulled his shoulder away from my touch, his chair scraping loudly against the tile floor, a harsh, grating sound that tore through the quiet morning. I froze, my hand hovering in the empty air where his shoulder had been, stung by the rejection. He turned his head slowly, lifting his eyes to meet mine for the first time since the night before. I expected to see the hunger I had seen in the bedroom, or perhaps a lingering softness, a shared intimacy. Instead, his eyes were empty voids. There was no love there. There was no excitement. There was only a cold, flat emptiness, and beneath it, something that looked terrifyingly like disgust. He looked at me not as his wife, the woman he had built a life with, but as something unclean, something that had been soiled. It was a look of revulsion, as if he were seeing a stranger he wanted nothing to do with. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. He had watched, he had wanted it, he had orchestrated it, but now that it was done, he despised me for it. "Coffee?" he asked, his voice a rough croak that sounded unused and rusty. He didn't wait for an answer. He just turned back to his mug, severing the connection, dismissing me from his presence without saying a word. I stood there for a moment, paralyzed by the injustice of it. He had been the architect of this nightmare. He had begged for it. And now, he was looking at me as if I were the villain, the fallen woman who had betrayed his honor. I withdrew my hand, tucking it into the pocket of my cardigan, feeling a cold stone of resentment forming in my gut. I poured myself a cup of coffee, my movements mechanical and jerky. I sat opposite him, but the distance across the small table felt like miles. We drank in silence, the only sound the ticking of the wall clock, counting down the seconds of a life that was rapidly disintegrating. I looked at the familiar objects in the kitchen, the toaster, the fruit bowl, the calendar on the wall, and they all seemed alien, artifacts from a civilization that had died overnight. We were survivors of a catastrophe, but instead of bonding us, the trauma had isolated us in separate bunkers of shame. The weekend stretched out before us like a vast, arid desert that we had to cross without water. We moved through the house like ghosts, haunting the same hallways but never occupying the same space. When he entered a room, I found a reason to leave it. When I cooked lunch, he ate it quickly, staring at his plate, avoiding any possibility of eye contact. We spoke only when absolutely necessary, and our words were clipped, polite, and utterly meaningless. "Pass the salt. Did you pay the electric bill? The grass needs mowing." It was a pantomime of domesticity, a hollow shell of a marriage held together by habit and the presence of the children, who were fortunately spending the weekend at his mother's house. Their absence, which usually provided us with a welcome respite, now felt like a curse. Without them as a buffer, there was nothing to distract us from the gaping hole in the center of our relationship. We were forced to confront the vacuum where our intimacy used to be, and the silence was deafening. I felt a growing sense of indignation rising within me. I had done this for him. I had overcome my own reservations, my own upbringing, my own fear, to give him the one thing he said he needed. And instead of gratitude, instead of a deepened connection, I was being punished. He had consumed the experience, fed his voyeuristic hunger, and now he was spitting out the rind. I felt used, not by Marcus, who had been honest in his desire and respectful in his departure, but by my own husband. Sunday arrived with a persistent, drizzling rain that trapped us indoors, intensifying the claustrophobia. I spent hours folding laundry, finding a strange comfort in the mindless repetition of the task. As I folded Michael's shirts, smoothing the fabric with my hands, I wondered if I still knew the man who wore them. He sat in the living room, staring at the television with unseeing eyes, the volume turned down low. He looked diminished, smaller than he had been 2 days ago, as if the act of watching had taken something vital from him. In the afternoon, I tried to broach the subject. I couldn't stand the silence any longer. The pressure was building behind my eyes, threatening to explode. I walked into the living room and stood in front of the television, blocking his view. "We need to talk about it," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "We can't just pretend it didn't happen." He looked up at me, and for a moment I saw a flash of the old Michael, the man I had married. But then the shutter came down, his face closing off like a fortress gate. "There's nothing to talk about," he said, his voice flat and final. "It's done. Let's just move on." Move on. As if we had just had a bad argument about finances or a disagreement about where to go for dinner. He wanted to sweep the ashes of our marriage under the rug and pretend the house hadn't burned down. He wanted to return to the status quo, to the safety of his newspapers and his lawnmower, but he didn't realize or refuse to admit that the status quo no longer existed. I walked away defeated. I realized then that trust is not a solid object that shatters with a loud crash. It is a liquid, and when the container is pierced, it simply drains away, silently and unstoppably. Our trust hadn't broken in a moment of dramatic betrayal. It was dissolving right now, in the quiet of a Sunday afternoon, leaving behind a sticky, foul-smelling residue of shame and misunderstanding. He didn't trust me because I had enjoyed it, and I didn't trust him because he had judged me for it. That night, we lay in bed together, separated by a chasm of cold sheets. I listened to his breathing, trying to match my rhythm to his, trying to find some synchronicity, but it was impossible. He lay on his side, facing away from me, his back a wall of rejection. I stared at the shadows on the ceiling, the same shadows that had witnessed my transformation on Friday night, and I felt a profound, aching loneliness. I was a married woman lying next to her husband, yet I had never been more alone in my life. I thought about Marcus. I thought about the way he had looked at me, with clear, uncomplicated desire. There had been no judgment in his eyes, no complex psychological layering. It had been simple, honest, and in retrospect, incredibly clean compared to the murky, polluted waters I was now swimming in with Michael. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of missing him. Not the man himself, but the feeling of being seen without shame. Michael looked at me and saw his own perversion reflected back. Marcus had just seen me. As the hours ticked by toward Monday morning, the reality of our situation settled over me like a shroud. We were not partners navigating a difficult passage. We were strangers stranded on opposite sides of a widening canyon. The river flowing between us was dark and deep, fed by the secrets of Friday night. I looked at the back of his head, watching the rise and fall of his shoulders, and realized that I didn't know how to reach him anymore. I wasn't sure I even wanted to. We had opened a door that was never meant to be opened, and in doing so, we had let a draft into the house that had extinguished the warmth of our hearth. The fire was out. We were just two people shivering in the cold, pretending that the embers were still glowing. I closed my eyes, waiting for sleep that I knew wouldn't come, realizing that the true tragedy wasn't the act itself, but the silence that followed it. We had survived the explosion, but we were dying from the fallout. The dawn began to creep through the blinds, turning the room a sickly gray. I knew that when the sun fully rose, we would get up, get dressed, and go to work. We would smile at the neighbors. We would talk about the weather. We would resume the performance of the happy suburban couple. But under the surface the rot had set in. We were standing on different banks of the same river, watching the water rise, knowing that the bridge was gone and we had no way to build it back. The currents were too strong, the water too dark, and we were drifting further and further apart with every beat of our hearts. The week that followed dragged itself across the calendar with the agonizing slowness of a dying animal, each day bleeding into the next with a seamless gray monotony. The tension inside the house had evolved from a heavy, silent pressure into something sharp and unbearable, a high-pitched frequency that seemed to vibrate in the very walls of our home. It was no longer just an absence of conversation. It was an active, hostile void that consumed every ounce of oxygen in the room. I moved through the hallways with my shoulders hunched, physically bracing myself against the atmosphere of judgment that radiated from Michael whenever he was present. The air was thick with unsaid words and accusations that hung suspended like smoke, choking the life out of the domestic routine we tried so desperately to maintain. By Thursday, the silence had become a physical weight on my chest, making it difficult to breathe, difficult to think, difficult to exist within my own skin. I realized that we could not continue to live as ghosts haunting the same property, ignoring the charred remains of our marriage that lay scattered around us. We needed to speak. We needed to drag the corpse of Friday night out into the light, dissect it, and decide if there was anything left to salvage, or if we simply needed to bury it. I decided that Friday evening, exactly 1 week after the event that had shattered our lives, would be the time for the reckoning. I needed closure, or at least a path forward, regardless of how painful that path might be. I left work early that day, driven by a manic, nervous energy that demanded action. I stopped at the grocery store buying ingredients for a simple, comforting meal. Roast chicken, potatoes, green beans, the kind of dinner that symbolized the stability I was desperately trying to reclaim. It felt pathetic, in a way, trying to fix a nuclear fallout with poultry and herbs, but it was the only language of care I had left. I spent the afternoon cooking, the kitchen filling with the savory scents of rosemary and garlic, smells that usually signaled warmth and family but now felt like a desperate, fragrant lie layered over the stench of decay. As the clock ticked toward 6, I set the table, placing the silverware with precise, trembling hands. I lit a candle, then blew it out, realizing that any attempt at romance would be grotesque in the face of our current reality. I sat at the kitchen island watching the driveway, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I rehearsed what I would say. I would be honest. I would tell him that I felt used, that his judgment was unfair, but that I was willing to work through it if he was. I was prepared to beg, to scream, to cry, anything to break the dam of silence that was drowning us. Michael's car pulled into the driveway at 10 minutes past 6, the headlights sweeping across the kitchen window like searchlights. I watched him get out, noting the stiffness of his movements, the rigid set of his shoulders. He paused at the front door for a long moment, his hand on the knob, as if steeling himself before entering enemy territory. When the door finally opened, the sound of the latch clicking echoed through the house like a gunshot. He stepped inside, bringing with him a gust of cool evening air that chilled the sweat on my neck. He did not come into the kitchen. He did not follow the scent of the dinner I had prepared. Instead, he stopped in the foyer, standing by the small console table where we kept the mail and keys. He stood with his back to me for a moment, his posture unyielding, radiating a cold, impenetrable energy. I wiped my hands on a dish towel, took a deep breath and walked out to meet him. The distance from the kitchen to the foyer was only 20 feet, but it felt like I was crossing a minefield, every step fraught with the danger of an explosion. When I entered the hallway, he turned to face me. His face was a mask of stone, devoid of the misery and conflict I had seen there over the weekend. The red-rimmed eyes and the trembling hands were gone, replaced by a terrifying flat calm. He looked at me not with anger, but with the clinical detachment of a coroner examining a cadaver. He was holding his leather briefcase in both hands, gripping the handle tightly, using it as a shield or perhaps a weapon. He didn't speak. He didn't say hello. He just watched me approach, his eyes cold and hard as flint. "Dinner is ready," I said, my voice sounding small and thin in the cavernous silence of the hallway. "I thought we could eat. We need to talk, Michael. We can't go on like this." The words hung in the air, unanswered. He stared at me for another beat, his expression unreadable, and then with slow, deliberate movements, he placed the briefcase on the console table. The click of the latch's opening was loud and sharp. He reached inside and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He didn't hand it to me. He tossed it onto the table, where it landed with a heavy final thud. "There's no dinner," he said, his voice devoid of any inflection. "And there's no talking." I looked at the envelope, my mind struggling to process the visual information. It was thick, substantial, the kind of package that contains contracts or deeds. I reached out and touched it, the paper cool under my fingertips. I opened the flap and pulled out the top document. The words "petition for dissolution of marriage" swam before my eyes, bold and black and undeniable. I froze, the breath caught in my throat, my world narrowing down to those few terrible words. I looked up at him, my vision blurring, a wave of dizziness washing over me. "Divorce," I whispered, the word tasting like ash. "Michael, why? We haven't even tried to talk about it. It's been 1 week." I took a step toward him, pleading with my eyes. "This was your idea. Your fantasy. You begged me for this. How can you divorce me for doing exactly what you asked me to do?" The injustice of it burned in my chest, a hot, rising bile. It made no sense. It was a nightmare logic that I couldn't unravel. He looked at me with a cold, sneering expression that twisted his familiar features into something unrecognizable. He crossed his arms over his chest, creating a physical barrier between us, and leaned back slightly, looking down his nose at me. "You really don't get it, do you?" he asked, his voice dripping with a poisonous condescension. "You think this was just about a kink? You think I just wanted to watch?" He shook his head slowly, a gesture of profound disappointment, as if he were a teacher dealing with a particularly slow student. "It was a test, Grace," he said, the words landing like physical blows. "It was a test of your character. Test of your loyalty. A test of your decency." My knees buckled and I had to grab the edge of the console table to keep from falling. A test. The concept was so twisted, so manipulative that I couldn't fully grasp it. "A test," I repeated, my voice shaking. "You orchestrated a scenario to destroy our marriage as a test?" "I wanted to see who you really were," he continued, his voice gaining strength, fueled by a self-righteous fury. "I wanted to know if my wife was the kind of woman who would let another man touch her just because her husband asked. A decent woman, a woman with morals, a woman who actually loved her husband, would have been disgusted. She would have refused. She would have slapped my face for even suggesting it. She would have threatened to leave me rather than betray our vows." He took a step closer, invading my personal space, his eyes boring into mine with a fanatical intensity. "But you didn't refuse, did you? You didn't even hesitate for long. You negotiated. You made a phone call. You invited him into our home." His voice dropped to a hiss. "And then I watched you. I watched you on that bed. You weren't doing it for me. You weren't enduring it. You enjoyed it. I saw the way you looked at him. I heard the sounds you made. You liked it. You reveled in it." I stood there, stunned into silence, the blood draining from my face. The rewriting of history was so complete, so audacious that I was speechless. He had turned his own perversion into a moral trap, and I had walked right into it. He had leveraged my willingness to please him, my desire to be adventurous for him, and twisted it into evidence of my own depravity. "You watched," I managed to choke out. "You sat there and watched. You could have stopped it at any moment." "I was gathering evidence," he said, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "I needed to know for sure. And you gave me everything I needed. You proved that you are exactly what I feared you were, a whore. A dirty, spoiled woman who isn't fit to be my wife." The insults were meant to degrade, to shame, but they only fueled a growing, cold horror in my gut. This wasn't just about a failed marriage. This was a calculated destruction. "You can't do this," I said, my voice gaining a tremor of steel. "It's my word against yours. You proposed it. It was consensual. No judge will grant you a divorce on grounds of adultery when the husband arranged the affair." I tried to cling to logic, to the legal reality, hoping that the sheer insanity of his position would crumble under scrutiny. He laughed then, a short, bark-like sound that lacked any humor. Oh, Grace. You think I'm stupid? You think I would leave something this important to chance? He turned back to the console table and reached into the briefcase again. He pulled out a small, black flash drive and held it up between us, catching the light from the chandelier. I didn't just watch with my eyes, he said softly. I recorded everything. My heart stopped. The room spun. What? I whispered. Recorded. Hidden camera, he said, enjoying my terror. In the bookshelf. High definition. Audio and video. It captured everything. The way you danced with him. The way you led him upstairs. Every disgusting thing you did in that bed. And most importantly, it captured the look on your face. It captured your pleasure. He closed his fist around the drive, securing his weapon. I have proof, Grace. Irrefutable, digital proof of your infidelity. Proof that you are a woman of loose morals. That's illegal, I stammered, grasping at straws. You can't record people without their consent. In our own home, he countered. I can do whatever I want. And even if it's not admissible in criminal court, it will certainly play well in family court. Imagine what a judge will think when they see this. Imagine what your parents will think. Imagine what the whole town will think when they find out the wholesome Grace is actually a deviant. He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. And imagine what the custody evaluator will think. The mention of the children shattered the last of my composure. You wouldn't, I gasped. You wouldn't use this to take the kids. I'm a good mother. This has nothing to do with them. It has everything to do with them, he spat. A woman capable of doing what you did on Friday night. She's unstable. She's immoral. She's not fit to raise children. I will sue for full custody, Grace. And with this video and the testimony of my distress, I will win. I will paint you as a nymphomaniac who destroyed her family for a night of lust with a stranger. I will leave you with nothing. No house, no money, and no children. I looked at the man standing before me, this stranger wearing my husband's face. I saw the meticulous planning, the cold calculation behind the emotional performance of the last few days. He hadn't been grieving over the weekend. He had been strategizing. He hadn't been crying. He had been reviewing the footage, editing his case. He had set a trap, baited it with his own desires, and waited for me to step on the trigger plate. You're a monster, I whispered, the realization chilling me to the bone. You set me up. You wanted this to happen. You wanted a way out, and you used me to get it. I gave you a choice, he said, his voice sanctimonious and calm. You made the wrong one. Don't blame me for your own nature. He picked up the briefcase, turned his back on me, and walked toward the stairs. Pack a bag, he said over his shoulder, not even looking back. I want you out of the house by tomorrow morning. My lawyer will be in touch about the rest. I stood alone in the foyer of our perfect suburban home. The smell of the roast chicken I had cooked with such hope was now wafting from the kitchen, a sickening, savory reminder of the life I had just lost. I looked at the envelope on the table, then at the empty space where Michael had stood. I realized with a terrifying clarity that my life was over. The walls I had built, the reputation I had cultivated, the family I had nurtured, it was all gone, incinerated by the flame of a single night. I had played the role he asked for. I had been the actress on the stage. But I had forgotten the most important rule of the theater. The director always has the final cut. And Michael had just edited me out of my own life. I sank to the floor, the cold wood hard against my knees, and for the first time since Friday, I began to scream, a sound of pure, unadulterated horror that echoed through the empty house, heard by no one but the ghosts of the marriage that had just been murdered.